December 18th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The winter dawn came slowly, filtering through a pale mist that clung to the pine trees like breath on glass. Snow crunched beneath heavy boots, and the distant rumble of artillery rolled through the hills like faraway thunder. It was the second day of what would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army, the Battle of the Bulge. And amid the chaos, in a land where every road twisted through frost-bitten forests and nameless villages, one man would take a turn that history never intended. Private First Class Harold Keller was no hero by design. He was a truck driver with the 47th Quartermaster Truck Company, a supply unit that hauled gasoline, ammunition, and rations to the front lines. His weapon wasn't a rifle or a machine gun, but a 5-ton GMC truck. Its cargo: jerry cans of high-octane fuel, lifeblood for the Shermans, and half-tracks now fighting for survival against the last great German offensive of the war. At dawn, Keller's convoy had rolled out from the supply depot at Spa, Belgium. The orders were simple: deliver fuel to an armored column near Stavelot, where American tanks were desperately trying to halt the German advance spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite SS formation that was cutting through Allied lines with brutal efficiency. The weather was miserable, the roads were iced over, and enemy patrols were already prowling the back roads disguised in captured U.S. uniforms. Most drivers were terrified, not of battle, but of the thought of being caught alone in those woods. The Germans had already ambushed several convoys. Trucks burned in the snow like torches, their fuel turning the white landscape black. Keller, though, had always believed in simple orders: follow the route, deliver the fuel, return home. But that morning, as his convoy approached a fork near Trois-Ponts, a sudden artillery barrage shattered the stillness. Shells screamed overhead. The lead truck exploded in a burst of fire and smoke. The drivers behind slammed on their brakes, scattering in panic as shrapnel clattered against their windshields. Keller ducked low, hands trembling, engine still running. He couldn't see more than 20 yards ahead through the smoke. The convoy commander's jeep was gone. Maybe hit, maybe lost. His radio crackled uselessly with static. And through the fog of confusion, a road sign barely visible through the snow pointed left. Stavelot. Another pointed right. Malmedy. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the echo of explosions ringing in his ears. Then, acting on instinct, he turned right. That decision, that single turn, would carry him straight into the frozen heart of a battlefield that was collapsing under the weight of confusion. It was, by every standard of the war, the wrong road. But fate has a strange way of working through error. As Keller's truck lumbered eastward toward Malmedy, the landscape grew eerily silent. The road wound between snow-laden trees, narrow and treacherous. He gripped the wheel tighter, eyes flicking between the icy ruts and the tree line. He had no idea that the town he was driving toward had, only hours before, become the site of one of the most infamous massacres of the war, where over 80 American prisoners of war had been executed by SS troops. The closer he got, the more desolate everything became. Burned-out jeeps lay in ditches. Abandoned helmets, half buried in snow, marked where men had fallen. He began to sense he was utterly alone and completely off course. Back near Stavelot, the fuel-starved Sherman tanks of the 30th Infantry Division were fighting desperately. Their engines sputtered and died as the last drops of gasoline were drained into jerry cans. The men could hear the German panzers closing in. Commanders sent frantic calls to rear depots. "We need fuel, or we can't move." But the roads were cut, the convoys scattered, and communication lines fractured. Somewhere out there, one truck, Keller's, was still moving, its tanks full. As dusk fell, Keller spotted a flicker of movement up ahead. the faint glow of a burning building in the distance. He slowed down, pulling his truck off the road to listen. The forest was alive with strange sounds, voices, engines, the metallic rattle of weapons. He could hear German being spoken somewhere close. He was now deep in enemy territory. For a moment, he considered abandoning the truck, fleeing into the woods. The cold alone might kill him, but at least he wouldn't risk being captured. Then he remembered what was in his cargo. Thousands of gallons of fuel. He thought of the tanks that depended on it, the soldiers freezing in foxholes waiting for supplies that might never come. He looked down at his map, soaked, torn, useless in the dark, and realized there was no clear way back. He was lost. And so, with nothing but instinct to guide him, Keller decided to keep driving. Not toward the depot, not toward safety, but toward the faint echo of artillery in the west, the direction of the front line. By midnight, he would be rolling straight into the chaos of one of the fiercest tank battles of the entire offensive, and his wrong turn would soon become the key that kept an entire armored division alive. The night deepened. Snow began to fall again, softly, silently, covering the tire tracks behind him like the world was erasing his mistake. And still, the engine roared on. The night of December 18th bled into the early hours of the 19th beneath a pale, watchful moon. The forest roads of the Ardennes were quiet now, but the silence felt heavy, the kind that hides movement, not peace. Somewhere beyond the trees, machine guns cracked, their echoes bouncing off frozen ridges. Every few minutes, the distant thunder of a German tank rumbled through the stillness like a heartbeat. Private Harold Keller had been driving for nearly 10 hours without pause. The wipers of his GMC truck screeched against the icy windshield, fighting to keep visibility through the relentless snow. The fuel drums in the back rattled with every bump. He didn't know exactly where he was anymore, only that the compass pointed west, and that west meant home. But home was chaos. The German offensive, launched on December 16th, had completely shattered the thin American front. In just 48 hours, the enemy had driven a massive wedge through the Ardennes, splitting the Allied lines. Roads that had been quiet supply routes just days earlier were now overrun by German tanks and paratroopers disguised as American MPs. Whole divisions were being encircled. Towns like St. Vith, Malmedy, and Stavelot were names whispered with dread in field radios. Fuel, more than bullets, had become the deciding factor. The American tanks could fight, if they could move. The Germans, too, were desperate for gasoline, raiding every captured depot they could find. Hitler's plan depended on speed. His panzers needed to reach the Meuse River before the Allies could regroup. But his fuel supply was razor-thin. Every jerrycan mattered. Every gallon could mean another mile toward Antwerp, or another stalled tank on the road. In this war of fuel, Keller's truck was a prize worth killing for. As he neared the outskirts of a small hamlet, Bellevaux-Ligneville, Keller spotted what looked like a column of vehicles half buried in snow. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Maybe they were Americans. Maybe he'd finally found his unit. But as he drew closer, his headlights reflected off something unmistakable. The black cross of the Wehrmacht, painted on the side of a half-track. He killed his lights instantly. The engine idled low, his breath freezing in the air as panic clawed at him. A group of German soldiers were gathered near the vehicles, laughing, smoking, their rifles slung casually across their shoulders. He counted at least a dozen, maybe more. He couldn't turn around now. The road was too narrow, and reversing would make too much noise. So, with every nerve in his body screaming at him to stop, he did the only thing that might save him. He drove forward slowly, pretending he belonged there. The Germans looked up, confused. The truck was American. No question. One of them raised a flashlight, shouting something in German. Keller didn't understand the words, but he saw the movement of a hand, the universal signal to halt. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out the engine. Then fate intervened in the cruelest, strangest way. From somewhere beyond the village came the roar of engines. Fast, powerful, familiar. American engines. A platoon of Shermans from the EB. 740th Tank Battalion had just burst from the tree line, firing as they came. Tracer rounds lit up the night. The German soldiers scattered, shouting in confusion. Keller didn't think. He slammed the accelerator, barreling through the village as bullets tore through the snow around him. His truck lurched forward, the engine howling, one headlight shattered by a stray shot. He barely missed a burning Jeep as he swerved onto the main road again, smoke and snow mixing into a blur. Behind him, the hamlet was burning, the firefight raging into the night. By dawn, Keller's truck was alone once more, rolling west toward an unknown horizon. He was exhausted, hungry, and half-deaf from the noise, but the fuel drums were still intact. He had somehow crossed enemy lines, not through planning or luck, but sheer stubbornness and chaos. Meanwhile, miles away, near the town of Stavelot, the situation was dire. Kampfgruppe Peiper's armored column, more than 100 tanks and vehicles, was advancing through the narrow roads, overrunning American outposts. In the rush, they captured a massive Allied fuel dump containing nearly 50,000 gallons of gasoline. But the barrels were frozen, the hoses useless in the cold, and Allied artillery soon targeted the depot. Peiper's men were forced to abandon most of it. The American defenders, holding the bridge at Stavelot, were running dry. The 30th Infantry Division's tanks couldn't maneuver without fuel. The officers radioed for emergency resupply, but all convoys were missing, destroyed, or scattered by the offensive, until a lone voice came through the static. Somewhere west of Malmedy, a single truck driver had been spotted heading toward Stavelot, hauling fuel. The message was uncertain, possibly garbled, but enough to spark hope. Fuel truck en route. Unknown driver. Still moving. The order was immediate. Find him. Protect him. By noon, Keller's truck was rumbling along a ridgeline overlooking Stavelot. From there, he could see the valley below. A frozen battlefield where columns of smoke rose from shattered tanks. Artillery boomed in the distance. He could smell the faint, acrid stench of burning fuel and cordite. He didn't know it yet, but the men below were waiting for him, their tanks silent, their engines empty, and if his truck didn't reach them, the entire line might break. Keller tightened his grip on the wheel, his breath shallow and his eyes stinging with fatigue. The wrong road had led him here, to the place where fuel meant survival. The place where one man's mistake would soon become a miracle of endurance. The morning of December 19th broke cold and gray over the hills of the Ardennes. Frost lay thick on the trees, and the distant rumble of tanks echoed like thunder trapped in the valleys. In every direction, the roads were choked with snow, wreckage, and men trying to hold the line. To the west, near the small Belgian town of Stavelot, American troops clung to their defensive positions with little more than grit and dwindling supplies. The 30th Infantry Division had been fighting without rest for nearly 3 days. Their M4 Sherman tanks, once the backbone of the counterattack, now sat silent. Engines frozen, fuel gone. The German SS under Joachim Peiper were pressing hard, their Tiger and Panther tanks prowling through the forests like steel beasts. If Stavelot fell, the Germans would gain direct access to the Meuse River crossings, the critical gateway to Antwerp. but everything depended on fuel. At the divisional command post, Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion stood over a map littered with red markers showing German advances. His men had already blown several bridges to slow Peiper's movement, but they needed their own tanks to move. And for that, they needed gasoline. The supply convoys hadn't arrived. Some were captured. Others had vanished in the blizzard of confusion. Then came a message. Faint, almost unbelievable. A single truck was on the road east of town, heading directly toward their position, full of fuel. Driver unknown. Possibly alone. No one dared hope much. It could be a trap. The Germans had been using captured American vehicles to slip through lines. But the need was desperate. On the ridge above the town, Harold Keller's truck came grinding down the slope, the engine coughing, gears grinding from overuse. His eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion, his hands stiff from the cold. He had driven for nearly 20 hours without food or sleep, guided only by the faint flashes of artillery to his west. He didn't know exactly where he was, only that the fighting seemed to be in front of him now. He could hear small arms fire, the echo of machine guns. The fuel drums in the back of his truck rattled with every bump, each one filled with the high-octane lifeline the Americans below needed to fight another day. As he neared the outskirts of Stavelot, an American sentry suddenly appeared from behind a stone wall, his rifle raised. Keller slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping. The soldier shouted, "Identify yourself!" Keller raised his hands, shouting back through the snow, "47th Quartermaster, fuel delivery!" A moment of tense silence. Then the soldier waved him forward. "Get that truck down there! We've been waiting for you!" He had made it. Somehow, impossibly, through enemy territory, wrong turns and chaos, he had arrived at the exact place where he was needed most. The engineers and tank crews swarmed his truck the moment it rolled into the square. Hands worked fast, cracking open the fuel drums, siphoning the precious liquid into waiting jerry cans. The air filled with the sharp chemical scent of gasoline and hope. Nearby, Major Ralph Davis, commanding a tank platoon, barked orders to his men, "Get that fuel to the Shermans now! Move!" Engines that had been silent for hours began to cough, sputter, then roar back to life. The familiar growl of armored power spread through the streets like a heartbeat returning to a dying body. For the first time in 2 days, American tanks began to move again. They rolled toward the eastern edge of town, where Peiper's column was advancing. The Germans had expected the Americans to be crippled, unable to maneuver. Instead, they found tanks that could fight, fueled by the cargo of one lost truck driver. By noon, the battle for Stavelot raged in full force. The American Shermans, newly fueled, took up defensive positions along the bridge spanning the Amblev River. Keller watched from behind a stone wall as the first shells screamed overhead. The ground shook as tanks traded fire across the river. At one point, a shell burst near his truck, ripping through its side and igniting the last of the empty drums. Flames leapt skyward, black smoke rising into the pale winter sky. Keller was thrown to the ground, his uniform scorched, his face cut by shrapnel. But he was alive, and his fuel had already done its job. The Germans launched wave after wave, trying to seize the bridge. The 30th Division held. The fuel Keller brought had allowed their tanks to reposition, flank, and ultimately halt Peiper's advance toward Stavelot. By the end of that day, the SS column had lost critical momentum. Peiper's vehicles began to run dry. His tanks, starved of fuel, stalled on the frozen roads. The Americans seized the opportunity, surrounding and isolating his force. Over the following days, the once feared Kampfgruppe Peiper was trapped, its men abandoning their vehicles and fleeing on foot through the forest. The German dream of reaching the Meuse, of splitting the Allied front, evaporated in the snow. And in the chaos, few realized that one of the turning points of that defense had begun with a single, exhausted truck driver who had simply taken the wrong road. By nightfall, Keller was treated for minor wounds at a field hospital near Spa. When asked where his convoy was, he simply replied, "I don't know, sir. I just kept driving." His commanding officer, upon hearing how his truck had reached Stavelot, reportedly muttered, "That's one hell of a wrong turn." In the days that followed, as the weather worsened and reinforcements poured in, Stavelot remained in American hands. Reports filtered up the chain of command about a lone truck delivering fuel under fire, helping restore mobility to armored units at a critical hour. No name was recorded. The Quartermaster Corps was vast, and heroes in that branch rarely made it into history books. But among the tank crews who fought there, the story spread like legend. The driver who appeared out of the snow, carrying fuel when all seemed lost. And as the Battle of the Bulge raged on, that legend became part of something larger. The story of how ordinary men, clerks, drivers, mechanics, kept the army alive. In its darkest winter, the snow kept falling over the Ardennes as the calendar turned to December 20th. What had begun as Hitler's desperate gamble was turning into a brutal test of endurance for both sides. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Men slept in their foxholes with frost stiffening their uniforms. The wounded were carried through snowdrifts so deep that stretchers had to be dragged by hand. The forest, once serene, had become a white tomb scattered with the remnants of tanks, trucks, and men who had simply vanished in the storm. In the midst of this frozen nightmare, the American line held. Stavelot, once considered lost, had become a symbol of stubborn resistance. The Germans under Peiper had been forced to pull back east of the Amblève River, abandoning dozens of their prized tanks due to lack of fuel. Their advance, which had begun with such terrifying speed, was now sputtering out in the same way it began, with tanks starving for gasoline. It was a cruel irony. The offensive that depended on capturing Allied fuel had instead been broken by one man's accidental delivery of it. For the men of the 30th Infantry and 740th Tank Battalion, those drums of gasoline from Keller's truck were more than fuel. They were time. Time to regroup, to counterattack, to live. The Shermans that had once sat dead along the ridges now prowled the streets again, their treads grinding over frozen cobblestones. Each movement, each shot fired, was made possible by a decision taken in fear and confusion miles away on a nameless forest road. In the cold days that followed, the German tide continued to recede. The American engineers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin, destroyed every bridge that might help the Germans cross the river again. Peiper's men were cornered, their supply lines severed, their morale collapsing. By December 23rd, their vehicles were out of fuel completely. They abandoned them, hundreds of tons of steel left behind, like monuments to the futility of Hitler's final offensive. Meanwhile, Keller, recovering in a medical tent, listened to the muffled sound of artillery echoing in the distance. The medics who patched him up didn't know who he was, nor what he'd done. To them, he was just another truck driver with frostbite and a concussion. But among the men at the front, stories began to spread. Stories of a driver who had appeared out of nowhere with gasoline, saving tanks that were supposed to die still. They didn't know his name. They just called him the Lost Driver. Back at the fuel depots in Spa and Liège, the quartermaster officers pieced together reports. One truck, they noted, was missing from the December 18th convoy, its driver unaccounted for. The vehicle was listed as presumed destroyed. Yet somewhere down the line, another report described a fuel delivery at Stavelot that didn't match any known order. Someone had gotten through. In an army of millions, such coincidences were easy to overlook. But in this war, it was often the smallest, most invisible moments that shaped the greatest outcomes. The Battle of the Bulge dragged on into January 1945. Allied reinforcements arrived from every direction. Patton's Third Army from the south, British divisions from the north. What had begun as a German breakthrough was now turning into a trap. The Ardennes offensive collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind shattered towns, burned forests, and a generation of soldiers forever changed. When Keller was finally discharged from medical observation, he returned to his unit quietly. The 47th Quartermaster Truck Company had suffered losses, and replacements were already coming in. His commanding officer handed him a new manifest, a new route, and a pat on the shoulder. There were no medals, no mentions in dispatches. The war still needed drivers, not heroes. He climbed back into a new truck. This one marked with a white star that gleamed faintly under a thin coat of frost. His hands rested on the steering wheel, scarred and stiff from the cold. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing at the map pinned to the dashboard. Another maze of roads, another set of coordinates. He smiled faintly. "Let's try not to get lost this time," he muttered to himself. Then he started the engine, and the truck rumbled back onto the road. Another anonymous link in the endless chain of war. Yet the legacy of his wrong turn lingered. The officers who fought at Stavelot later recorded that the sudden arrival of fuel had allowed them to mount a defense that otherwise would have been impossible. In after-action reports, the words appeared again and again. Unexpected resupply. Fuel arrival just in time. Unknown driver. The details blurred into legend, but the outcome was clear. The bridge at Stavelot held. Peiper's panzers stopped, and from that point onward, the German offensive began to die. The world would remember Bastogne, Patton's march, and the frozen courage of the infantrymen who stood their ground. Few would ever speak of the truck driver who made a wrong turn that day, but every victory has its invisible hands, those who, without intention or recognition, hold the line between collapse and survival. The war in Europe would last only a few more months, but for Harold Keller, the road through the Ardennes would remain etched into his memory forever, a place of fear, of luck, and of quiet purpose. He had not meant to be brave. He had only meant to follow orders. Yet history has a way of turning mistakes into miracles. When the snows of the Ardennes finally began to melt in February 1945, the true scale of the Battle of the Bulge became visible. What had once been a dense forest of frozen pine was now a graveyard of machines. Tanks burned to their frames, trucks twisted in ditches, rifles half buried in thawing mud. The roads that had carried men to war now lay silent, lined with the remnants of the desperate winter offensive that had marked Nazi Germany's final breath. In those weeks, American engineers cleared the wreckage from roads Keller himself had driven only months before. They found the remains of convoys destroyed in ambushes, wrecked fuel trucks still chained together, and the frozen bodies of drivers who never reached their destination. Few stories emerged from that silent carnage, but among the men who survived, one memory persisted. The nameless driver whose truck had appeared out of the storm at Stavelot. Official histories of the Battle of the Bulge would later credit the victory to the resilience of the American infantry and the quick maneuvering of reinforcements. They would speak of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, of Patton's bold advance, and of the heroic stand at Elsenborn Ridge. But within the ranks of the 30th Infantry Division and the 740th Tank Battalion, the tale of the lost driver became its own quiet legend. The story traveled through mess halls and supply lines, told by soldiers who had seen tanks come back to life that day, who had heard engines roar again after hours of silence. Each time it was told, the details shifted a little. Some said he had driven through enemy fire. Others swore he had crossed a mined bridge at night. A few claimed he was never seen again. But the essence of it never changed. One man, one truck, one wrong turn that had kept an entire front alive. For Harold Keller, the war ended not with glory, but with the dull stillness of homecoming. He returned to Ohio in the summer of 1945, discharged with a handful of service ribbons and a quiet heart. He took up work at a local transport company where he drove long-haul routes across the Midwest, peacetime roads lined with cornfields instead of craters. To his neighbors, he was simply a dependable man who kept to himself, polite and steady, with a scar above his temple and a habit of checking the road signs twice. Only once. Years later, did he speak of the war? It was at a veterans gathering in 1961. Someone asked what unit he had served in. He answered softly, "Quartermaster Corps." They nodded politely. Supply men rarely drew curiosity. But then, as the evening grew late and the talk turned to the Battle of the Bulge, he looked down at his glass and said, almost to himself, "I got lost once, brought fuel where they needed it most." That was all he said. And yet, in that single line, there was everything: fear, luck, and the strange quiet heroism of ordinary men who never set out to be remembered. The Battle of the Bulge was not won by glory alone. It was won by endurance, by men who endured the cold, the confusion, and the loneliness of war. It was won by mechanics fixing tanks in snow, medics wrapping frozen hands, and drivers navigating roads they'd never seen before. It was won by those who kept moving when reason said, "Stop." Keller's story, though buried in the dust of history, captures something deeper than strategy or victory. It reminds us that history often hinges not on grand plans, but on small acts, on human error transformed by courage, a wrong turn that becomes the right one, a single truck that keeps an army alive. In the long winter of 1944, thousands of American soldiers held the line against a desperate enemy. Their courage turned back the last German offensive in the West and opened the road to final victory. But behind those front lines, behind the headlines and medals, there were the quiet ones, the fuel convoys, the cooks, the clerks, the nameless drivers who never fired a shot, but whose labor fed the fire of freedom. Somewhere among them drove Harold Keller, his hands frozen to the wheel, headlights cutting through the fog, unaware that every mile he traveled was carrying him closer, not just to danger, but to immortality. In the end, history didn't record his name among the heroes of Stavelot. There were no citations, no commendations, no statues in his honor. But perhaps that is fitting, because his story belongs not to one man, but to all who served in silence, those whose mistakes became miracles, whose fear turned into endurance, whose duty carried them farther than courage alone ever could. And so, when we speak of the Battle of the Bulge, of that winter where men fought in the snow for the soul of Europe, we should remember, too, the sound of a lonely engine on a frozen road, echoing through the pines, a truck that should never have been there, a driver who refused to stop, and a wrong turn that helped win a war.